head off with our heavy bags to check in. And everybody else had checked in already, and there was a half a plane full of standby passengers because the flight was way overbooked. And there were many people that wanted to get on that flight. So we're checking in. And the lady who was checking us in, I should have realized was a full-fledged Soviet apparatchik. She had a red armband on her arm, which she was still wearing. We didn't see these anywhere else in the country by 1993, but she was wearing hers, and I should have realized, here's a hardliner all the way. And she checked us in, and she said, half of you, 12 of you, have bags that are overweight, and you must pay for them. I said, fine, we've done this before on previous trips. We would like to pay. And she says, this will be X number of $100 US. And I said, no. Every trip I've been on in the Soviet Union and in this country have been paid by rubles, and I will pay for the overweight bags with rubles. And she said, no, you will pay with US dollars. I should have known at that point that it was fruitless to go any further, but I kept kind of negotiating with her, but to the point where she became very frustrated. And she said, all right, if you want to be like that. And she looked across the room, and there were 12 people sitting over there who were our standby passengers. And she said, you're on. And all 12 of these people go rushing through security to get onto the plane. And she said, so the 12 of you who have tickets and your baggage is okay, then you're good to go. Well, I was one of the ones that had overweight baggage, so I was one of the 12 that wouldn't go. Now, fortunately, my buddy Jim Cunningham had come with me on the trip, and we've been friends since we were young teenagers. Now we teach together, and we've been friends for at least 65 years. And this is way back in 1993. And Jim said to me, hey, I've got a boarding pass. You take it and go, and I'll take yours and stay here with the half of the group. I was really hesitant to do that, but what could I do? So, and we were going to Khabarovsk to pick up 1,000 Chinese Bibles to take for the rest of our trip. So Jim stayed. He traded with me so that he could stay and I could get on the plane. I walked out to the plane, and just at this time, they were pulling off the suitcases that of the people, of the 12 of us who would not be going on the flight. And one of them, of course, was mine. And I was fortunate to be there just as he's pulling it off. And he said, no, you leave it there and you take this one off. And I pointed at Jim's bag, and they took off Jim's bag and put my bag back in the plane. So at least that part went fine. So now I'm on a flight with half of my group to Khabarovsk, and I am just full of mixed emotions. Like, how could I have done this and leave half my group in Magadan? Because it was unbelievable that this could happen. And so we get to Khabarovsk, and a young gal named Marina is going to be our guide. It's her first time ever to be a guide. She's a lovely young lady and very helpful. And I explained to her what happened. She said, oh, that's terrible. She said, let's go to Intourist right now and get this straightened out. So we went to Intourist, and they apologized profusely, and they said, your tickets should have been provided. We will reimburse you for what you paid for these extra tickets, and we will try and make this up to you. And all through our trip, for the rest of the time we were in Russia, we kept being told, oh, you are the notorious tour group that had such a problem. And we were easily able to get the 14, I think it was it 14, no, 12 boxes of Chinese Bibles that totaled about 1,000 Bibles. So that meant that if we all got together again and went into China, we would have 40, each one of us would have 40 Chinese Bibles in our suitcases. So got those boxes, and we got on a flight to Irkutsk that was originally scheduled. But now we find out nothing has happened to our group back in back in Magadan. In Magadan, they were still there, and they of course had to reschedule their flight because everything was full and it was too busy, and it was now too late to come to Khabarovsk and go over to Irkutsk. So it was then decided that they'd wait an extra day, and then they would fly directly from Magadan over to Irkutsk, and we would meet up together there. Well, we arrived in Irkutsk, and Interest had been so interested in making things up to us that they provided 3 tour guides, not 1, not 2, but 3 of them. And they were lovely young people, really interested in giving us a good tour and helping us to overcome the challenges of what we'd been through. On that first night when we arrived in Irkutsk, we heard that our other half of the group from Magadan was going to be arriving in Irkutsk. We went out to the airport to meet them late that night, and I have never been happier to see people in my life. Here's the other half of my tour group that got split up, and they're all still living, they're all smiling, and they said, "Have we got a story to tell you?" And so we couldn't wait to get on the bus, and on the bus to the hotel, they tell us their story. And I have to tell you the short form. But what happened was they didn't have anybody looking after them. I mean, Larissa and Tanya had left when we got dropped off at the airport, and there was nobody. She was the only in-tourist guide in the whole city. So now they have to look after themselves. Well, they found another gringy little hotel not far from the airport, and so they were able to put themselves up in this little thing, and they had a meeting together. And they said, the Lord only does these kind of things for a purpose. Maybe we're here for a purpose that we got left behind, and we need to figure out what that is. And somebody said, well, look, we got all this overweight. I mean, we don't want to be going through this overweight luggage thing much longer. So let's take at least like the clothes, the things that are good clothes, because we're here in Magadan, where a lot of people didn't have a lot of nice clothes. So they can sure use these clothes here. Let's at least get the extra clothing out of our suitcases and bring them down to a little more. And some other medicines and some other Russian language books and things. We'll leave them here. And so that was the plan. They decided. They said, we'll go find that pastor of the 400 young people. And so they went to the place of a contact that they said, we're looking for a pastor. They didn't know his name. They didn't know where he lived. And but they remembered that they were told at the first place they looked for him that his wife's name was Elena. So they start going around looking for Elena. They're asking people, do you know where Elena lives? And they were, somewhat in the general area of where the pastor and his family lived. And somebody said, some young person misunderstood them and thought they said Elvena. And so Elvena was a name very close to Elena. And so they said, oh, we know where Elvena lives. And nobody realized that they're talking about 2 different people. And so they took, it was Jim, my buddy, and Evelyn, a lovely young lady from Grand Prairie who spoke some Russian and was a great traveler, one who traveled with us for many, many years. And the 2 of them then went to find this Elena. And so the young man takes them to a door, and they knock on the door, and this big bruising man named Boris comes to the door. He understands a bit of English, and he says, why do you want my wife? And so then Jim and Evelyn told him their story about how they got left behind. Well, it turned out that Boris, who was the husband of Elvena, Boris was the KGB head officer for Magadan. And they had no idea, of course. And he's looking at them. Here are these foreigners, Canadians, standing at his door, nobody looking after them. no reason to be in the city, and they really shouldn't be in the city at that time. And why are they looking for this pastor? But he knew the pastor. So he said to them, come on in, you sit here and wait. And they sat down, and they were served some lunch and whatnot. They were very, very hospitable. There was no threat. There was nothing threatening at all about this. And they were told, and he said, I'll find this pastor for you. Well, in the afternoon, Boris was going to a Japanese celebration in the stadium of the city. And there were some very special guests from Japan that had come, and they were having a big celebration party there. And Boris, of course, had to be responsible for security. He had to go, and he said to Jim and Evelyn, you come with me, and we're going to go. And so they went, and they were seated among the Japanese VIPs. They sat there through this whole program outdoors. This is summertime, late July. And they had an incredible time. Well, afterwards, suddenly across the field of the stadium comes the pastor. And he is looking really close. And when he saw Jim and Evelyn, he broke into a big smile and gave them a big warm hug, because the KGB had come to his house and said, you get over to the stadium, Boris wants you. Well, the pastor had no idea. Why does the KGB want me? And what's going on? And he was really nonplussed. Well, when he gets there, he sees Jim and Evelyn, and they, of course, explain their whole situation. And he says, yeah, bring this stuff to my house. So they get the rest of the group, and they take all these suitcases of extra stuff and leave it with the pastor. And Boris turned out to be a godsend, the head of the KGB in that area. And then they were able to get tickets to Irkutsk, and they rejoined our group. Wow. I sighed the biggest sigh of relief that I think I've ever sighed when they joined us. We stayed in Irkutsk for several days. A wonderful city, great place to be. We went to church there on Sunday, had a wonderful experience at a house of prayer, as they call their church buildings there. And we went out to Lake Baikal, which is the largest lake in Asia and the deepest freshwater lake in the world, Lake Baikal. And Jim even went swimming in it. It's very cold because it's so deep, but he was even willing to dive in and enjoyed a swim in Lake Baikal. From Irkutsk, we took the Trans-Siberian train for 3 days and 3 nights. It was actually 67 hours. And we spent time on the train with all our meals in the dining car, mostly Russian sausage and cabbage or whatever, and then around the outside of Mongolia, this train runs to the Chinese border. Now, the Chinese and the Russians have never been long-time friends. They were under communism a lot more, but pre-communism in 1949, China did not want Russian trains having the capability of flying into China. And so China has different gauge railway tracks than Russia does. And so it means that if a train is coming through from one country to the other, they have to stop at a border area. It's a gringy little town, and they have to take a crane and lift the carriage of each carriage of the train and put new wheels underneath that are the gauge for the other side of the border. We had to do that. Now, remember, we've got suitcases full of Chinese Bibles, which, if discovered, would be taken from us. And we didn't want them taken. We wanted them for believers in the country. And so we were quite concerned because we had to leave all of our stuff in there. We had showed them our passport. And the Russian security was no problem leaving the country. And we had to wait 5 hours while they changed the train wheels from one gauge to another. And it was a long wait, and we were quite concerned that we couldn't be in there taking care of our stuff at that time. We get back on the train and we go through a no man's land area, and we arrive in China, and the security people come on board, the customs people look at our passports, they look at us and see that we're tourists, and they just almost ignore us. There was hardly any checking at all, and we were able to get our 1,000 Chinese Bibles into the country without any trouble. And we crossed the border, spent a day and a half traveling through northeast China, all the way down to Beijing. And we arrived early in the morning, and boy, were we happy to get there. We got a beautiful hotel with a nice hot water where we could have a great shower and clean up, and then have a buffet breakfast that was second to none anywhere. It was everything that a Western breakfast has and everything that an Eastern breakfast has. And we were back in shape again as Western tourists. That Sunday, we went to a Three Self-Patriotic Movement church in downtown Beijing that seated 1,000 people. We were being guests. They put us up front, and we and our tour guide, whose name was Daisy, English name Daisy, we were among 1,000 people listening to a very evangelical pastor preaching. Now, this was a church where Billy Graham, just months before, had been visiting the country and had preached at this church. He was one of the few foreigners ever allowed to preach in a Chinese government-controlled church. But he did, and it was this particular church where we were. It was an amazing Sunday. We met some wonderful Christians there in that church and had heard lots of stories about situations that they were experiencing. But the most significant thing was that Daisy was just hanging on every word that the pastor was preaching. And he was preaching a classic gospel sermon with a story about Jesus from the Gospels. And she said to us after the service, "I was so impressed with that service that I want to become a follower of Jesus." And Daisy today is a follower of Jesus, one more of the millions in that country who followed the Lord. From Beijing, we went back to Harbin in the northeast, a beautiful city of the north, and from there back to Khabarovsk, where we met with the Marina again. And again, on our very last day, back now in Russia, going to get a flight to Seattle on Alaska Airlines. The last day we were there, we were allowed to go to a children's hospital, and we did our whole program again and left everything that we had there at the children's hospital. And in the afternoon, they took us to FEBC's radio station, and this was the Piece de Resistance. When I worked with FEBC, Diane and I lived in Manila in 1971 to 79, working with international broadcasters at the compound in Manila. Shortwave radio, one of those beams went due north from Manila right up to Khabarovsk and the eastern part of Siberia. And Jack Koziol, a Canadian missionary, was the preacher, the Russian preacher who would preach the gospel in these programs. Mostly, there were some other programs as well, learn English, music, different things in Russian. But Jack was the main Bible teacher. And the Soviets built a radio station in Khabarovsk just to jam, as they called it. They called it jam the signal that FEBC sent up there, to create like a buzzing noise so it would just irritate listeners. They couldn't hear what was being said because a local station was jamming the same frequency with a crazy buzzsaw kind of noise. That was a jammer. Well, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russians in Khabarovsk sold that radio station that was the jammer of FEBC. They sold it to FEBC. And FEBC today owns that radio station that for years was designed to jam their gospel radio programs, and that now it is a source of programming itself, sharing about Jesus to the people of Eastern Russia. What an incredible experience. So this is the story of the day I lost half my tour group in Siberia. At the end of this trip, we all got together and we said, we had all kinds of challenges on this trip, but we still felt it was the most interesting experience that we had ever had as we've traveled the world. And we saw God at work in many ways, and it was just a very special time. So look for special events. If you do mission trip tour groups, the Lord will surprise you.